Do I need to record to the cloud?
Oh, wait a minute.
Fall 2020.
Oh, I just realized this is the lecture's screen that I'm.
No, this is my screen.
Is it?
Yeah. I'll share screen with him in a bit. This is
okay.
the intro.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yes. No, you're right.
So if we want to record this, then I have to also record it to the cloud?
Yes. If you want, yes, the live stream is also being recorded to Facebook and to YouTube. So
this will give us the opportunity, and this way I can also then download that and pass it back to the lecturer if he wants to.
I can do the same.
Oh, you can too?
Yeah, I can.
So there's no need for me to do that?
You don't have to. No,
okay.
I mean, I can send you the link to the video.
Okay, excellent. Good to know that. Yep.
Hopefully I don't forget. If I do, just remind me.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's what I forgot to do the other day. We had a graduate open house, and I was supposed to record to the cloud, and whoops, I forgot to.
Well, so you can set your.
I do when I do set up my own, but Kristen had sent the thing to set it up for me.
Got it. Okay. Let me go check the.
Okay, Sekou, I'm going to start admitting people to the lecture now, just so that you know, and I'm going to mute for a bit here.
Okay.
pause, come join us for the lecture, okay? We have 74 individuals online in the Zoom. There are also participants that are able to watch the lecture on Facebook and YouTube Live. We probably have a much larger audience. This lecture is being recorded, and we're piloting right now, coming back live from the great space at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, which is where we usually have our lectures. And today we have the camera set up so that you look out and see a small audience here in person. Next week, I'm talking to you. Can you hear me?
I think he's trying to talk to us.
Can you hear me? Are you having trouble hearing me? Okay, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, I was on mute. That's why you guys didn't stop talking when I said that we were live and recording on Facebook and YouTube when you guys were having those personal conversations. But we will edit that out of the broadcast version. So I was just saying, today we have on the Zoom, we have 76 people. We have others that are tuning in on Facebook Live and on YouTube Live. And we're broadcasting today back in the great space of the School of Architecture, which is where we usually do our lectures. But as you can see, we have a small group here today, and we hope that next week when we have a lecturer in person, that our faculty members that conduct studios will all have their studios here live and in person on next Friday, so that it'll be back to a normal grouping of people. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Kelly. I'm the director of the architecture program here at the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. I want to welcome all of you today. I want to take a moment to pause and for us to recognize where we've come from. The University of Maryland is built on land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. Subsequently, the land upon which the campus is located is likely to have been worked by some of the over 300 enslaved African people who were the property of Charles Benedict Culver, the founder of the Maryland Agricultural College, the predecessor to the present-day University of Maryland. So we ask that you pay respect to the Piscataway people and the enslaved African people whose lives were tied to these lands. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Before we introduce tonight's lecture, the fall lecture series has two more major events, as I alluded to a moment ago. Next Friday, live, in person, here in the great space of the School of Architecture, we will have a lecture focused on affordable housing solutions in a time of social inequity and change. It'll be delivered by Marianne Cusado, a faculty member from the University of Notre Dame. And then following that, on Wednesday, the 10th of November, there'll be an afternoon-long symposium that will take place here in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, both here in the great space and in the auditorium. And that lecture, that symposium will be titled The Politics of Memory and Place, and the keynote for that is Anne Applebaum, someone, a very important scholar that I think we're going to all want to listen to. Tonight's lecture is made possible by the Guy Lombardo Lecture Fund. In fact, all of the lectures that we host here at the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, are the result of the generosity of others. And Guy Lombardo, the Lombardo family, endowed this lecture after the premature death of their son, Guy Lombardo. And this was done probably about 30 years ago. And ever since then, this has grown to a rather significant endowment that has helped to enrich the lives of students at the University of Maryland. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Joseph Mckinley, who will introduce tonight's lecturer. Joseph, come on up here.
All right. So we want to thank Sekou Cooke, who's the principal of Sekou Cooke Studio, for joining us today. He is an architect, researcher, educator, and curator born in Jamaica, like myself. He's coming to us today virtually from Charlotte, North Carolina. He's also the newly appointed director of the Master of Urban Design program at UNC Charlotte, and a recipient of the 2021-2022 Nasir Jones HipHop Fellowship at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He also holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University, a Master of Architecture from Harvard. Today, he'll be talking to us about hip-hop architecture, an emergent field, a theoretical movement reflecting the core tenets of hip-hop culture with the power to create meaningful impact on the built environment and give voice to the marginalized and underrepresented within design practice. Today, Sekou plans to talk about his monograph, the MoMA exhibition, and his piece, Grids and Grigot, at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. So we're very thankful that Sekou is coming to us virtually today and want to welcome him to our school. What's that?
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, Brian, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak to all of you. I was hoping to be there in person. Sorry. The exhibition that I did, or part of the MoMA exhibition, Reconstructions, that was on last year, actually earlier this year. Geez, how time flies. And then, and I'll end by talking about the newest work at the Chicago Architecture Biennial called Grids and Griot. And it's interesting in Brian's introduction, the land acknowledgement that we're also acknowledging the violence, displacement, migration, and settlement of lands. And in a way, that's a lot of what I'll be talking about today, and how architecture has a very important and active role to play in all this. So let's get into it, shall we? Avigal is kind of a shout out to a good friend of mine. I've been tripping on how to give titles for lectures recently. So I've just started naming them after good friends and loved ones. So hopefully you'll forgive me for doing that. But I think what we're all here to hear about is usually hip hop architecture. And hip hop architecture here in all caps with a period at the end is more referring to the book, the monograph that was released in April of this year, with the foreword written by Michael Eric Dyson. And the first part of the lecture will just give a kind of outline of the book. If you haven't gotten it yet, it'll give you a kind of insight and maybe impetus to go out and order it and have your own version, your own copy. So the book is intentionally organized as an homage to albums with multiple volumes and different tracks. The square is definitely a reference back to CDs from the 90s when I was coming up in hip hop culture. And sorry about that. So the first volume, and just so you know, if you've been to one of my lectures and haven't heard my dog, then something is definitely wrong. So I'll try to get him to calm down for a second. Come here. Here. Gotcha. Awesome. That's Gizmo. Say hi, Gizmo. So the first volume is really the introduction, where I lay out the basic manifesto for hip hop architecture as I see it. Prologue, that's really the structure of the entire book and why it's structured in the way that it is. But starts out with a disclaimer, which was something that came to me maybe 2 years before I actually started writing the book, but I knew it was something that I had to say right off the top. So disclaimer quite famously starts with the line, "This book is not for you." And it's really separating out the primary intendants of architectural books, which is usually a kind of literati, a kind of architecture elite. And really, this is not supporting any people, any areas that have been exclusionary in the past. It's not really about anything that is of a specific race or a specific class, but it's really for the people who have really been struggling in the realm of architectural education for decades, the marginalized people who haven't really found a home in the kind of westernized way of architectural education. And the disclaimer ends by basically stating that why I position myself in the book and how I do, and clarifying that I don't consider myself a hip hop architect or even a Black architect. I'm an architect, and that this book is really for architects, however they define themselves in their practice. The book also includes some excerpts, lyrics from different hip hop tracks that talk about architecture of the built environment. This one from Nas, and of course they're blank quotes because getting the rights for hip hop lyrics or any kind of music lyrics is much more complicated than I thought. But I put a citation in the book with the actual track and the time code where you can find the quote that I'm looking for. And this quote was from Nas saying, "You want me to sound like everything on your top 40? I'm not for you, you're not for me." And the second volume is really where the broad theory is more laid out, and it goes into some historical aspects of the topic of hip hop architecture, where it came from, underlines Nate Williams and his work from 1992 as a kind of godfather of hip hop architecture, where he did his Cornell thesis on the topic, way before anybody had even thought about bringing their hip hop identity into their architectural practice. It deals with, right off the front, it deals with issues of race and gender, but also then goes into issues of commodity and technology. And then there's a track on grids and griot, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So this is a kind of outline or sample of what it's like, how the book is laid out. The authenticity chapter uses the Sugar Hill Gang as a kind of benchmark touch point about what authenticity means in hip hop. How authentic do you need to be a hip hop artist, and what that might mean for architecture, architectural practice. In that section, we also finally define what hip hop architecture is. And this is something I've been resisting for the first few years that I delved into this research. But we're really looking at hip hop as a broader culture that's about people's identity. And it's way more than just a singular genre of music. And then architecture, we're thinking about and talking about as something that is reflecting people and social consciousness of people. And if that's the case, then an architecture of hip hop is not only possible, but it's necessary. The more Reader's Digest version or the elevator pitch version of the definition that I finally came up with in 2019 was that it's hip hop culture in built form. So whatever that means for you, or however that, if you're ever in a conversation, you need to explain that, that's might be the best starting point. The book is also not a singular voice. So throughout the book, between tracks, there are these interludes, and these are excerpts from transcripts of symposia or lectures or other events where we had hosted over the years around hip hop architecture. And so here you see some of the other voices like Craig Wilkins, Andres Hernandez, Taya Wynn, and there are many, many others that are included throughout the book. The third volume is where we get into the work, the design work done by students, theorists, practitioners, artists that fall under many of these different categories, primarily image, process, and identity. Then I talk about form and space, the bookend, the volume, and urbanism is a kind of outlier where I've been building some of my urbanist theories that have landed me in this position as the urban design director here at UNC Charlotte. So some of the work is work like this, which is collaborations by architects and graffiti artists to design pavilions. This is Maurer United Architects and Zeds, a pavilion design in the Netherlands. This is work by sports, Molly Hunker and Greg Corso. This is the City Thread project in Chattanooga, Tennessee. This work by John Stott in Brooklyn, New York, looking at layering of architectural drawings and how graffiti can participate in that layering. This is a project by Theaster Gates, who many of you know is a pretty well-known artist, ceramicist really, but has transformed large areas of the south side of Chicago. This is a project that was done in Bristol in the UK. It's called Sanctum, and it's in this middle of this bombed out church, but using all these salvage materials. And so he's not an architect, but operating as an architect in many ways. Then it also includes student work. So this is recent thesis project by Mauricio Zamora, who got his MArch degree at UC Berkeley. So he was continuing the legacy started by Nate Williams 25 years before, doing his thesis on hip hop architecture. And then some of my own students' work. So I've run a couple hip hop architecture studios over the years. This one, the student Scott Crabeth is looking at diagramming a typical hip hop track, an early hip hop track, with all the samples and the waveforms and identifying where the samples came from and using that as a way of thinking about an urban design strategy in DC. This is it's another project from that same studio by Evie Brooks, where she's looking at the coded language of graffiti and how if we decode the movements, the different types of movements through a section of the city, we can recode it in this graffiti-esque language and then use that as a way of thinking about the landscape urbanist gestures within the city itself. The fourth volume, the final volume, is really where we get into tangential aspects of architectural practice that may be related to hip hop, but aren't explicitly about hip hop, like deconstructivism, Afrofuturism, activist architecture, Neopost Modernism, informal settlements. But the volume starts out with Kanye, and I think Dana's in this picture. No, she's not in this picture specifically. But this is when we as the AASU brought Kanye to the GSD to really, and this was a kind of inflection point where the world of hip hop was meeting the world of architecture in a very important way. And I talk quite about the significance of Kanye as a figure in the design world and in the hip hop world, and how those two worlds could meet in that track, in that chapter. Deconstructivism, as you all know, is formally interested in breaking apart the standard construction logics of buildings, and it starts to look a way or something like what hip hop architecture might be conceived of in people's imaginations. This is a still from the Jermaine Dupri and Mariah Carey's music video for one of their music videos, using the Bilbao as a backdrop. And then Afrofuturism, which is a movement that's a musical, artistic movement, but has also found its way into architecture, thinking about the futures of Africa and using similar collage techniques that we talk about in hip hop architecture. Informal settlements is a way of an aspect of architectural practice that allows for the informal to inform the formal. So this project is a really great project by Elemental, Alejandra Aravena in Chile, where they designed basically half of the project and allowed the more informal parts to evolve over time as people started to inhabit the space. And then what I'm calling Neopost Modernism, which is more of a new movement that's referencing the postmodernists from 20 or 30 years ago, but now are using terms like sampling and mashup and remix to describe the type of work that they do. So the first image was from Kyle Miller, and this image is from Jennifer Bonner. So I'll shift gears a bit and talk a bit about the work in the Reconstructions exhibition, Reconstructions show. So this was an exhibition and a book put on by, book published by MoMA in the series of their Issues in Contemporary Architecture series. So you may be familiar with Rising Currents or Foreclosed or Uneven Growth, dating back to 2011 and 2012. So this was the next iteration of that. And it was curated by Sean Anderson on the left and Mabel Wilson on the right. And for the show, they invited 10 architects and designers, along with, not pictured here, David Hart, who's an artist photographer, to do a video installation piece. But these 10 were really assigned a city to then think through the history of Blackness and architecture and how that could result in a newly commissioned work. So
it's been really hard for brown and black people to imagine a future in this country.
It's been a real challenge because Black people in America are not given the space to even just be.
In order then to think about possible futures, somehow we have to reimagine ourselves in new places and then find ways to get there.
We're not just interrogating America's history with Blackness, we're interrogating architecture's history with Blackness.
So for me, interrogating America's history with Blackness and interrogating architecture's history with Blackness all comes to bear in the built environment. And so because I had been thinking about and researching many aspects of Syracuse, New York for several years, I thought that was a likely city to start to study, even though it wasn't on the original list that they gave us to consider. So the story of Syracuse is the story of almost any town USA when it comes to understanding the history of Blackness in America. So the 15th Ward in Syracuse was the center of Black commerce, primarily owned by Jewish immigrants, but then they were the only ones who would rent or sell to Black settlers. So that's how this has happened in many, many cities. And so the 15th Ward was an area of thriving growth for the Black community in Syracuse. And then a few years later, this is what it looked like once new urbanism and the New Deal, the massive infrastructure projects that cut across America started to cut through the center of cities. So most of that area was cleared out, and most of those people were displaced. So as we look at this aerial photograph, what we're seeing here is I-81 cutting through the center of the city, but we're also seeing the primary medical complex of universities up to the top right. To the top left is the Civic Center, which was the real center heart of the 15th Ward. And then just south of that, in the center of the picture, are two public housing projects. McKinney Manor on the left, which is actually, before that was another public housing project that used to be there before. And then Pioneer Homes, which is one of the oldest housing projects in New York State and in the country. And you can see the highway actually cuts through the center of the public housing project itself. So it divides the project into two pieces, which is quite jarring to say the least. And what's happening now is or has been happening for the last few years, is this new organization called Blueprint 15 is investing quite a lot of resources and energy to rethink that whole area. And it's because most of the land where I-81 is going through that is being slated for demolition is owned by the Syracuse Housing Authority. And the idea is that when and if that viaduct comes down, then now there's an opportunity to rethink all that housing. But they're really what they're planning on doing is really revisiting or recreating the same mistakes that had happened in the past. So what they're thinking about is they've hired purpose-built communities as the primary developer of this area. And they, on the Blueprint 15 website, they have this quote about Atlanta's East Lake, which is such a huge example of success. But what's happened in East Lake, if you know anything about the history there, only about 22% of the residents were able to come back after they had been displaced. And any measure of success for any purpose-built communities project is anything anywhere near 25% is measured as success. So that is quite jarring, especially given the fact that in this project specifically, they are not replacing low-income housing with more low-income housing. They're actually going to have less units in total, and they're replacing the low-income housing with mixed-income housing. So there is almost zero chance that anywhere near 25% of the people who live there will ever return. So that idea helped me to grab onto a couple of these quotes that I'll show you in a second that are about this history of placement and displacement that has been the history of Black people in this country, as Catherine McKittrick is talking about here. That's just the general way that we've been developing cities over the entire history of this country. And then the second quote from The Wire, this is from season 3, episode 1, where they're tearing down the public housing project that used to be their home, and also where they would sell drugs, of course. But it's that, you know, they're gonna tear this down, they're gonna build something else, but people, they don't really give a fuck about people. So these are the kind of underlying attitudes that I used to start this project. And also looking at maps of all this, the historical maps dotted here, you're seeing some of the traces of what used to be on in the area. And then we were able to uncover some of these historical drawings, these early drawings of pioneer homes and McKinney Manor. And if you look closer, you'll see these dotted lines are outlines of tenement houses that used to be there before, that were torn down and replaced with the public housing project with pioneer homes. So more examples of that here. And from McKinney Manor, again, another really interesting thing is that before McKinney Manor was an even higher density housing project that you can see dotted here with those outlines. So there's even a third layer of history, built history that was there before. And to just round out the attitude of the project, I was looking at these video stills from Wiaucha. There's a couple of tracks called Wiaucha. The other one is a little bit even more violent than this, but that's why I decided to title the project. It's called Wiaucha, Hip Hop Architecture and Architecture and Digital Fabrications. And architectural fabrication and hip hop fabrications and public space is what it was called. Sorry. So then what I did was basically overlap all of these layers of history, overlap and intersect them. So what you're seeing in orange are the areas of intersection of all these layers of buildings that used to be on the site. And these now create a new landscape of the public sphere, the public space that is between buildings. And they're meant to be informal follies for informal entrepreneurial activities or recreation or other kinds of uses that are typical, that sometimes get criminalized within Black communities. And then the big white rectangles are placeholders for a kind of imagined banal design that would be done by purpose-built communities that wouldn't be too dissimilar from the Eastlake projects. And then those boxes are also subtracted from, so the form of the traces of the buildings that are going to be removed are remembered in these subtractions in the presumed new form. And this is what it looks like in axonometric view, and how that groundscape would be occupied and coded. And these are some of the plans that were imagined and generated through that. So the plans are also a kind of collage, so they're literally cut and paste from some of the Eastlake buildings in Atlanta to then collage them back together in this composition. And continuing with the idea of collage to complete the set of drawings that were in the MoMA show, a section collage, and then a couple of these perspective collages. And the last layer to elevate this from mere drawing an image to something that's more of an art piece is re-inscribing or screen printing over on top of these drawings, the historical drawings that we had found and uncovered in the research process. And this is what it looks like in the MoMA show itself. And then accompanied with these larger perspective renderings that are also collaged with figures. The figures are actually extracted sometimes from famous movies. then a long section and elevation. And then you see some of the quotes that I talked about before are re-inscribed in these drawings. Okay. And the last piece of the collection that was in the show was an actual stoop. So imagining what the construction process would be for chopping up and dissecting the buildings that are actually there. And then I sacrificed the stoop from my old house in Syracuse. This is from the backyard. So we then cut that diagonally, transported it to the shop in Syracuse in the winter time, and then built this base of laminated plywood that also is thinking about a kind of middle scale of subtraction. So the stoop is the 1-to-1 scale. There are these smaller scale models that are 3D printed and laser cut and assembled. And then the in-between scale is the plywood, and then this little chunk of concrete that, when put together, is reminiscent of what's happening at the smaller scales in the drawings and in the model. So this is that stoop piece all put together, massive 800-pound piece. And this is how it all came together in the exhibition. And I like pictures like this with people actually engaging with the stoop, with the work. And for, if anybody's familiar at all with any kind of museum, you know that you're never supposed to touch the work, but this is something that I wanted to make sure was allowed and that people could do. Okay, so I'll briefly talk about the BRC, the Black Reconstruction Collective, which really came out of that moment of time at MoMA, and as a act of refusal to the typical structures of how MoMA commissions artists and architects to work. We've set up a whole nonprofit 501c3 structure. We are currently working on a few projects, a couple projects that are gonna come online in over the next year, and also are actively searching for a coordinator for the collective. That's an administrative position. But in last fall, we started out with a series of lectures that we're giving before the MoMA exhibition at Columbia, Harvard, and MIT. And then last spring, we did a series of lectures at Georgia Tech, USC, and Penn State. And all of the lectures started out with this introduction video, which I'll show right now.
A nation constituted in conflict with its own ideals would need to be reconstructed before it could be fully constructed. It would need to go to war with itself and win, then reconstruct itself differently. This is not rebuilding, but reconstructing to the core of governance, citizenship, history, infrastructure, and the distribution of land. Paradoxically, the people who did the constructing and must now do the reconstructing are likely to be the same. Laborers in one instance and authors in another. Designers of this nation and of themselves.
And of themselves. The Black Reconstruction Collective commits itself to continuing this work of reconstruction in Black America and these United States. We take up the question of what architecture can be, not a tool for imperialism and subjugation, not a means for aggrandizing the self, but a vehicle for liberation and joy. The discipline of architecture has consistently and deliberately avoided participation in this endeavor, operating in complicity with repressive aspects of the current system. That ends now. We commit ourselves to annihilating the willful blinders that have enabled architecture to continue to profess its Eurocentrism as a virtue and claim apolitical ends. We reject the boundaries.
We reject the boundaries established by nation states, challenge the spatial manifestations of anti-Black racism, and encourage creative agency and liberatory practices. This collective portal unites activists, scholars, architects, artists, and organizers across time and space. With this commitment to Black freedom and futurity, we dedicate ourselves to doing the work of designing another world that is possible here, where we are, with and for us.
So that was a collective reading of our manifesting statement, which comes together really beautifully to illustrate how this is really a collective and how we are overlapping and touching and stepping around and through and on top of each other at times. And then that was the subject of this piece, this manifesting textile piece that was hung in this strategic position at the entrance of the show, right beside the Vietnam helicopter, and covering the name of Philip Johnson, who's the gallery is named after. Okay, so lastly, I'll start talking about grids and griot. And so that title came from the chapter in the book where I was talking about the relationship between the grid, which is thought of as a neutral tool within architectural practice, and the Black body. And so first I was invited to be part of this year's iteration of the Chicago Architecture Biennial called The Available City. And this is a project, has been an ongoing project by David Brown, now applied to the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And it's about looking at all of the empty lots that exist across Chicago, the city of Chicago, and the size of that is the size of most small cities. So there's a whole nother a city that's available. So
if you look closely, you'll notice that the pattern on this soft broadcloth shirt is made of working man's blood and praying folks' tears. If you look closer, you'll notice that this pattern resembles tenement row houses, project high-rises, cell block tiers, discontinued stretches of elevated train tracks, slave ship gullies, acres of tombstone.
So the interesting part of that clip for me from Mostef's A Soldier's Dream is this this discussion of this fabric, this weave that is a grid in essence, but is reminiscent of these other gridded forms across the city: elevated train tracks, tombstones, cell block towers, public housing, and slave ship gullies. So, and this is what I talk about in the chapter on grids and griot, is about the first confrontation between the Black body and the grid was in the slave ship gully, which is about efficiency, and it continued through slave quarters and through public housing, and contraposing that against the image of the griot, who is a figure in West African culture, who was a storyteller, an entertainer, and also a kind of keeper of the oral legacies of a community. And Adam Banks, who wrote a book called Digital Griot, talks about how the figure of the griot has survived all of these different parts of American history, and has now become preachers and poets and stand-up comedians and DJs. And so the DJ as a figure or a digital griot is something that Adam Banks talks about, and also DJ Spooky, who writes about this. He talks about the DJ being a kind of a griot figure who works against the grid in a very specific way. So these are the ideas that I was using to think through this project. As part of the Available City project, the Chicago Architecture Biennial project, David Brown was very interested in not just selecting architects and giving them a site to design something from scratch. He really wanted to partner community organizations that owned land with specific architects. So when he knew that the YMen, Young Men's Educational Network in Chicago, had some land in the North Lawndale area on the west side of Chicago, he thought that I would be a good partner with them for this project. And so what we started with on this empty lot is actually 2 lots, side 50-foot double lot, just south of this shipping container area, which was already being used by YMen to store bikes. It's like what they call it, their bike box, where they store bicycles, they lend out bicycles, have tutorials to help people know how to fix bicycles. There's also a kind of elevated, a raised planter bed area there along South Pulaski Street in North Lawndale neighborhood. So that was one starting point. The other starting point we had was this color palette that they had developed with a graphic designer to paint the outside of that shipping container in a very powerful graphic way. So starting with that and looking at the kind of pervasive grid within the city, from the scale of the city itself, the street grid to the facades, and this is just across from the site. This is all these beautifully layered grids on top of each other were really quite beautiful. And then even the shipping container itself is kind of this gridded object, this gridded thing. So we started there. So there's a 40-foot shipping container already on site. We decided to start with a new 40-foot container. So we're now amplifying what's already there instead of bringing something completely new to the scene. And then thinking about chopping this up, slicing this up in a non-orthogonal way, breaking the grid in any way we can, spreading that out to allow for occupation in one way, and then taking the tops off of some of these pieces and spreading them out across the site to now create a new kind of organization of occupiable program across the site. And then this is, and on the north there, you can see its relationship to the existing shipping container. And so all the programming that happened here was programmed based on what YMen was already doing on the site and what they wanted. And the layout was something that came from them as well. The last step after this was all distributed was to insert these plywood panels that would finalize exactly what the program of each area would be. And the vertical surfaces we highlight here to really see as a potential for image or graffiti or for a mural, something that is now revealing some history or some talent or some other lost aspect of what used to be here in the city. Again, something that is very reminiscent of what a DJ does when they sample different records. And then the last part of this, which was really important, was in a couple ways, first to anchor down some of the pieces onto the ground, and also to reinscribe this reference grid back onto the ground, these concrete pads that are strategically placed across the site to bring back the idea of the grid and it's the relationship of moving against that grid. And so here we can see some of the programming, benches, seating, gathering areas, a performance space, a couple retail sheds, and then some planter areas. And on the top left is some additional bike storage for Wyman organization. And these are some renderings of what we imagine this to look like and how it was going to be positioned on the site. Okay, and then so the fabrication was relatively easy, actually surprisingly easy. All we had to do was order the shipping container, have it delivered to the Cochrane group in Chicago, who would then just literally chop it up and use their forklifts to pull it apart. So almost like the diagram coming to life in this way. And here you can see some of the little L brackets that were welded on the inside of these pieces to accept the plywood panels or to anchor it down to the concrete. And then they were placed on site. They were delivered to the site and placed in exactly the locations that they needed to be across and distributed in that way as raw material. On the left, you can see another entry into the biennial going up. That's the soil lab. You can look them up separately. And so on the weekend that we came in, about a week before the opening, we had this great help from the Wyman organization that brought out all these kids, actually paid them for their time and effort. Most of them had never painted anything before, but we used them as we wanted them to be involved and invested and feel ownership of the project. So we were very adamant about having them participate in the painting and final fabrication of the project. On the right there, you'll see in the Puma shirt is Jose Estrada, who ran all the local logistics for the biennial. That was incredibly helpful in getting the project together. So we had them painting all the insides of these using that color palette. Again, only the inside of the shipping container painted as a counterpoint to the outside of the other container being painted. Then the plywood panels were painted in the same colors to match what was going in here. Here you can see one of the plywood panels becomes a bench, and that's being painted the same color. This is Heather Warren from my office, who came down to Charlotte from Syracuse to work for me and was really instrumental in getting this project assembled and put together. This is just right after assembly, the first assembly. And then right after the assembly was done, we had all this, they just happened to have all this soil ready to place into the planter beds and some flowers to plant there, which was quite handy to have it all finished up at that time. And this is the whole thing kind of together. And then on the opening day, the opening event, then there was press. You can see the soil lab is more finished on the left-hand side. The ability of me talking to press about the project. These are actually, so the soil lab was sponsored by the Danish consulate, the Danish embassy, and these are all the Danish embassy people coming for the soil lab opening, but posing and taking pictures in front of our project. And of course, this was a nice little picture of a child of one of the Danish ambassadors sitting and reading while they were talking to the press. Yeah, and I'm just ending with a couple nice texture shots of the piece in location. The truck, that mural on the side of was on the side of the Wyman truck. That mural is by a graffiti artist called Centrock, who we're hoping to maybe paint some graffiti pieces on our projects. And there's a great picture just showing that even the undersides of these things we wanted to paint just to keep consistent with the project itself. All right, so the last thing I'll say, I've kind of gotten to the end of my time here. is coming back to one of the precepts in the book. I've talked a lot about hip hop architecture in different ways and in different forms, and show different ways that it can actually become real and tangible. But this is a diagram that's in the book, reproduced in the book, that was originally created by Craig Wilkins, who is an architect and author, one of the first people to write about hip hop architecture. And in one symposium, at the end of one symposium conversation in New York City, he said that hip hop architecture should be a model for architecture practice, period. And that took me aback, and I had to stop and think through that for a while, and then wanted him to address that in the next time he had a chance to talk. And the next time was in the show in St. Paul, where he developed this diagram and was really talking about each discipline has an object that it's interested in, and the disciplinary boundaries go slightly outside of that object. So architecture in this case goes slightly outside of the object, which is buildings or the built environment, to include a few other ideas. But that hip hop architecture is interested in several other aspects of the way that we live: community empowerment, environmental sustainability, entrepreneurship, and many other things that I've talked about today, cultural identity. And that hip hop is already invested in all of that. And really what needs to happen, he's proposing, is that architecture as a discipline needs to grow to encompass all of those things. And that hip hop architecture is already providing a model for how to do that. Not that every architect needs to be a hip hop enthusiast, or everybody who practices needs to try to think about the tenets of hip hop architecture and apply that in their work, but that hip hop architecture is really interested in changing the way that we practice and think about architecture in order to be much more inclusive and empowering. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for, am I in front of the camera? There you go, for that really great lecture. And we have about 30 minutes or so. I wonder if there are any questions in the audience or from those joining us online for our guest lecturer today. And I guess if you're online, just unmute and ask. Yeah. Or type it in the chat and I can read it aloud. Oh. Just working on a couple of technical things. 1 second.
Actually, Sekou, could you just unshare the screen so we could see the whole audience? There we go. That's nice there.
Right, so any questions? Is there a question over there? I'm gonna give you the mic so you can.
What is fascinating about the hip hop architecture?
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing the question.
Okay.
Can you hear me, Sekou?
I did not hear the question, no.
Okay, so the question is, what is, I don't want to misquote you, what is fascinating about hip hop architecture?
What is, say again, you might have to speak into the mic for the computer.
This mic or this mic? Not sure. The question is, what is fascinating about hip hop architecture?
What is fascinating about hip hop architecture?
Yeah, that's the question.
That almost seems like a question for you. Why are you here? But I can tell you what fascinates me about it. You know, it was something that when I was in undergrad in the 1990s, in the early mid 90s, at Cornell, we had a kind of critical mass of Black and brown students there that didn't happen in any era before that time and hasn't happened in any era since. That we had so many years of such a high percentage of the cohort there, a high percentage. It was actually still below the demographics of the country, but we had enough of a critical mass there to talk about concepts like this. So a couple years before I got there, Nate Williams had presented his quite famous, now infamous, thesis presentation on hip hop architecture, where he had like, and I describe it in the book, he had a live DJ mixing during before his presentation and blew everyone away and won the thesis prize for his project. So people are still talking about that a few years later. And so I was fascinated that it was even possible to bring any part of your cultural identity into the studio or into architecture, into your thesis. And I think at the time I was still, you know, first 2-3 years, I was still trying to figure out what the hell architecture is. How can I even survive? How can I just pass my studio classes? And then really understood that maybe by the thesis year, this is a space that I could actually thrive. I could get to a place where I can look into my own culture and express it. So my own thesis wasn't explicitly hip hop architecture. It was, you know, it used some of those collaging techniques, but it was cited in Jamaica and thinking about some historical layers there. It's actually more similar to what I did for the MoMA show than anything more explicitly hip hop oriented. And so that was something that I remained fascinated by while I was in undergrad. Then I kind of forgot about it for a while and forgot about academia for a while until I decided to go back to grad school, which was, you know, like 13 years later after I had practiced, been licensed, taught for a few years already in CCA and in Syracuse. And then I was able to at the time in the early 2012, 13, while I was at the GSD, Kanye talking about architecture again reminded me about this topic of hip hop architecture, reminded me about how powerful it could be, how transformational it could be. At the time, I was still attending NOMA conferences where we're still talking about, 40 years later, 50 years later now, why we're still talking about how underrepresented Black people are in architecture. And I was like, here it is. Here's the answer, right? If people who are respected in the Black community, who are cool, who are seen as hip, who are seen as transformational, who are connecting to kids, if they are starting to talk about architecture, if they are interested in shaping the built environment, then this is an immediate answer, a kind of formula for how to get more and more Black and brown kids into architectural education. So what fascinates me most about the whole topic is its potential to transform the entire discipline of architecture, sheerly by its power to change the representational demographics.
Okay, so we're gonna ask one more question, and then for technological reasons, we're gonna have to wrap up very shortly. But there's a question in the chat from Hannah. A wonderful presentation. I remember you discussing allusions to hip-hop lyrics. Is there any moment where you've brought patterns and ideas from the music itself?
Yeah, so in the book and in the exhibitions, the exhibitions that I'm referring to are the Close to the Edge, the Birth of Hip Hop Architecture exhibition from 2018 that was at the Center for Architecture in New York, and then went to St. Paul, Minnesota in 2019. And many of you will be happy to know that it's gonna come back in 2022 in DC. So at the Octagon Museum, we're gonna do at the AIA headquarters there, we're gonna do another version of that exhibition. Yeah, so in that show and in the book, we talk about how architecture can actually, our architectural logics, architectural form, architectural processes can actually be extracted from each of the different basic tenets of hip hop. So the four basic elements of hip hop are DJing, MCing, b-boying, and graffiti. So DJing, obviously, the Grids and Griot project was thinking about the DJ as somebody who chops things up and moves things around and has a different kind of relationship to the grid than most other people. And then graffiti is a kind of easy one-to-one communication with architecture because graffiti covers all these surfaces and immediately changes environments, but has the ability to become more three-dimensional, as you saw in those examples from Zeds and Morrow United Architects, and from sports with the City Thread project, that graffiti can actually be occupiable in a certain way. And then b-boying is, the lines and the forms of a body can really create a whole language that one can create architecture from. But the lyrics themselves, we definitely are thinking about the structure of the lyrics, the organization of the lyrics, the kind of referencing, the deep references that are hidden in the lyrics. So we can start talking about semiotics when we think about hip hop lyrics and how they translate into architectural production. I've actually taught a series of seminars while I was at Syracuse, each one over 4 years, looking at each of those elements and how they intersect with architecture. So yeah, there's quite a lot of work that has been done in those realms that is embedded within the book. The book is kind of a groundwork for several threads of thought that can come from that. And the threads of thought that I'm picking up right now are primarily focused around technology, the technological aspects of hip hop culture and architectural technology, and the urbanism aspects. So.
All right, well, thank you. And it sounds like the answer also to the question is that we need to go buy your book if we haven't done that already. But I think Professor Kelly wants to make some closing remarks, and I just want to personally thank you for accepting this invitation to come and talk to us today.
Sekou, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And when you're here in DC, please reach out to us. We'd love to meet you in person. Maybe get you to come out to school and be on a review or something. Let's keep our fingers crossed that in the spring things are much more closer to normal than we're used to. I think it's a great theme of how do you make a translation between something that's temporal and ephemeral like music and dance into another medium that tends to be, well, it's still temporal, but it's a little bit more tangible and formal and concrete like architecture. And it is an interesting proposition to think about. And so I applaud you for the good work. I think that the exhibits that you showed us, particularly the one at MoMA, was beautifully executed. and hope our paths keep crossing again in the future. Thank you very much. And one of the things we came up against is I didn't bring a charger down here, so my computer is about to die, and we're not sure what happens when it dies. So thank you very much. And to the students and faculty, hope to see you again next week, and stay tuned. Be well.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it. Have a good day.